G'day everyone. Why do we have an appendix? You know, that thing that just seems like a ticking time bomb, ready to cause lots of grief, and seemingly serves no function? Today, I'll explain what the appendix is, the role that we now know it serves, which I'm sure that many of you have heard of before. I'm also going to explain why we can live with it in the modern world, and why it evolved in the first place. The evolutionary history of this little guy is really interesting, so stay tuned for that. Okay, what is the appendix? The vermiform or worm-like appendix is a small outpouching of the cecum, which is a part of the large intestine, but it's essentially the junction between the large intestine and the small intestine, which means that the appendix is found sort of down there. And it is usually about 1 centimeter long, or about 1/3 of an inch for my American viewers. It contains a lot of mucosal associated lymphoid tissue, but more specifically it contains GALT, gut associated lymphoid tissue. It is immune tissue and it acts as the hub for immunity for the whole gastrointestinal tract, which I will now refer to as the GIT, for gastrointestinal tract. This immunological hub that's found really commonly in the appendix essentially interacts with the trillions of bacteria in our intestines, regulates them, and basically decides what is friend or good bacteria or foe, bad bacteria. And this tissue is key to the appendix's main function, which we're going to move on to now. The main function of the appendix, as many of you may know, is acting as a reservoir for the gut microbiome. So, hey, Andrew. Can you guys hear that? Andrew. Hey, oi, Andrew. What's the microbiome and what's so special about it? Well, I'm glad you asked. I was just about to talk about that. And where did you come from? So before we discuss the significance of the appendix, we must first discuss the significance of the microbiome, because it plays a key role in the story today. I'll start with a very short analogy. One time I saw a guy that was wearing a shirt that said, "Hello, I'm 30 trillion human cells and 39 trillion bacterial cells. Nice to meet you. I'll show you one here." This shirt goes so hard that I think it might become the next TikTok micro trend. But as amused as I was by this, it brings up an important point. We as humans are what is known as holobionts, which is an assembly of a host organism and many smaller species that live on or around it. So for us, that's us as the host and these trillions and trillions and trillions of bacteria that live in our gut, on our skin, across our whole body. And that shirt was not lying. We are actually outnumbered by bacteria, by pure cell count. And that's a pretty crazy thought, but don't be too disturbed because bacterial cells are much smaller than ours. Despite outnumbering our cells, they only make up about 1 to 2% of our body weight. Still though, that's significant, and it can have a very large impact on our health, and it in fact does have a large impact on our health. And with possibly about 99% of all of these bacteria living in our large intestine, it is super important that we keep that microbiome healthy for the sake of the health of the host organism, i.e. us. Okay, so let's talk about what a healthy versus unhealthy microbiome looks like and what it does for our health. A healthy microbiome boasts the following characteristics. It is highly diverse with lots of different species. It has a balanced composition with high levels of good bacteria and low levels of bad bacteria. It is producing beneficial metabolites, that's 3. And it has functional redundancy, which means that multiple species can perform the same function, which means that if one is lost or if there's a little bit of an imbalance, that the microbiome as a whole can still function pretty normally. So that's 4. So we should be doing a lot to keep our microbiome healthy, but what does a healthy microbiome do to make us healthy? So our microbiome is beneficial to so many things in the body, but I'll list a few standouts here. Digestion and metabolism. The microbiome has an absolutely massive repertoire of metabolic ability, which means that a lot of the things that we as humans cannot digest, our body can't digest, that microbiome will be able to. And that helps us get nutrients. It also helps to produce many vitamins such as vitamin K and B vitamins. And it also, a healthy microbiome this is, produces short-chain fatty acids, which are super important, and you've probably heard of them. And they are anti-inflammatories. They essentially reduce the inflammation in your body, which we all know is a good thing. The microbiome also gives us immune support, which may be surprising to you at first, given that they're bacteria. But the microbiome helps to train our immune system to be able to tell friend from foe. It trains our immune system to tolerate good bacteria, and it also teaches the immune system which bacteria are bad. And it'll also quite often stop the proliferation of bad bacteria because the bad bacteria simply can't get going. It's almost like a small business versus like mega corporations. The small bad bacteria can't get in and proliferate when there's trillions of bacteria around. It can even have an effect on our mental health, which is pretty crazy to think about. It produces neurotransmitters, which can affect your mood, your sleep, etc. As I said before, the microbiome is linked to so many conditions, and a healthy microbiome is associated with lower rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular issues, etc. An unhealthy microbiome, surprise, surprise, is the opposite of a healthy one. Yeah, obviously. But that means that there's less diversity, less redundancy, more bad bacteria and less good bacteria. And this will result in higher rates of infectious disease and chronic disease. So that's gastrointestinal infections and chronic diseases such as diabetes, obesity, and things like that, metabolic syndrome. The microbiome is super interesting, and I could talk about it for hours because we're really just scratching the surface here. If you want a full video about that, comment that down below and I'd be more than happy to make one. But for now, let's move on because the purpose of this video is about the appendix. Okay, so how does the appendix support the microbiome? Why is it important for that? So as I mentioned earlier, it can act as a reservoir for the gut microbiome, which is critical to the recovery of the microbiome from cases like illness or antibiotics, which can drastically affect the microbiome. And I think this image summarizes this well. An illness wiping out the good microbiome, but the appendix can act as a backup to rebuild it, almost like a hard drive or a shelter. Okay, so this brings us to our third point for the day, which is, if it's so important, then why can we live without them? So there's basically two schools of thought as to why we can survive without one. Firstly, we need to be thinking of this appendix like a safe house, like a shelter. Society can survive without one in the event of a zombie apocalypse, but it's the main shelter where people are going to go. People or microbes are going to go. But microbes can still survive in the many nooks and crannies of the GIT, just like those people in zombie movies that sort of stake out in their house and then they eventually rebuild society or whatever. The other reason we can live without them is that modern society doesn't select for them like the world did back in caveman times. This is because of antibiotics, good sanitation, probiotics, fermented foods, microbiota transplants, etc. And all of these things can help rebuild the microbiota in the case of an infection, but these things have also drastically reduced the frequency of infections. That doesn't mean that there aren't disadvantages to not having one. People with their appendixes removed have a much higher rate of recurrence of Clostridioides difficile, which is a really nasty gastrointestinal infection, because the microbiota can't be reseeded as well like you would with an appendix. And so it's more difficult to build up a healthy microbiome that can stop the recurrence of Clostridioides difficile. But as we discussed earlier, with modern medicine and sanitation, this has gone from a really bad health issue to not as significant. And just generally, the health of the microbiome is often worse without an appendix, with less diversity and less good bacteria. Okay, so that's why we can live without an appendix. Let's move on to the evolution of it and why it was important in the first place, because it is super interesting. In 2013, one of the most famous evolutionary biology articles of all time was released, titled Multiple Independent Appearances of the Cecal Appendix in Mammalian Evolution and an Investigation of Related Ecological and Anatomical Factors, with the first listed author being Heather Smith. This groundbreaking study was magnificently undertaken, with 361 mammalian species investigated for the presence of an appendix, and 50 of them were found. And these species were then plotted on an evolutionary tree. And evolutionary trees look like this. They found that the species that had the appendixes were scattered so far across the evolutionary tree that an appendix must have independently evolved at least 32, but possibly 38 times. The word independently is the most important word here. This indicates that the appendix is not just some random remnant from a distant common ancestor, but rather it is an evolutionary advantage, and hence it evolved independently in many different species. And this suggests that the appendix has a role to play in survival, because evolution is ruthless. If something isn't needed, it's not going to last very long. It's going to get removed straight away. There's no point in wasting that energy on it. And the fact that it evolved so many times independently means that it must have given a survival advantage to the animals that got one. The proof is in the pudding too. Another groundbreaking study in 2021 by Collard et al. Displayed that, weight for weight, because weight roughly predicts an animal's lifespan, the appendix would increase longevity. In other words, when comparing animals of the same weight, which should have the same lifespan, if one of them had an appendix, it would live longer, it would have a longer lifespan, thus further supporting the idea that the appendix is not some mistake of evolution, but rather a little worm-like tube of longevity. An important side note to this is, if you, presumably a human watching this, have had your appendix removed, that isn't necessarily going to decrease your lifespan. In fact, it probably won't. An analogy for this is that the appendix is like an evolutionary insurance policy against gastrointestinal infections. Which is great, but not having one doesn't matter with modern medicine being our new insurance policy against really bad infections. Antibiotics, probiotics, microbial transplants, advanced medical care, etc. That is our new insurance policy. Okay, so hopefully you've learnt a bit about that little structure that's near your right hip, or that used to be near your right hip if you've had it removed. And hopefully you now know why it's important, why it evolved in the first place, and why they're not absolutely critical anymore. If you did learn something new or you just enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, it would mean so much to me. That being said, my name's Andrew, this is Andrew's Lens. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to keep enjoying life. See ya.